Helmand Province, 2009. British infantry on patrol are taking fire from between 500 and 800 meters. Nothing in the patrol can answer it. The rifles they carry cannot reach. The machine gun can reach, but cannot pick. The one weapon in the British inventory that could do both, the bolt-action L-96, is a specialist's tool that nobody carries on a routine foot patrol. So the Ministry of Defense writes an urgent operational requirement, a document that exists for exactly one purpose: to admit that soldiers are dying of a gap nobody planned for. 440 rifles, 1.5 million pounds, in service by May of 2010. That gap had been written down before, not in Helmand, in Moscow in 1958, as a state requirement by the main artillery directorate of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. It was solved by 1963, and the man who solved it spent his working life in Izhmash, building rifles for Olympic target shooters. His name was Yevgeny Dragunov. He won the competition by building something a target shooter would call a bad rifle, on purpose. Dragunov described the job in his own words, years later. It was a series of contradictions. For reliable operation in difficult conditions, he said, you need the largest possible gaps between the moving parts. For better accuracy, you need everything fitted as tightly as you can manage. Loose to survive, tight to hit, and a whole series of large and small contradictions after that one. He never solved them. That was the design. In 1975, 12 years after the rifle entered service, at the height of its reputation, the Soviet Army reached into Dragunov's design and made it measurably worse. 19% worse, by a number the Russians themselves recorded, deliberately. That single decision is the reason the West could not copy this rifle for 60 years, and it is the last thing anyone tells you about it. Subscribe if you want the rest of this, because that 19% the Soviets threw away in 1975 is the part almost nobody tells, and it explains everything that came after. Yevgeny Fyodorovich Dragunov was born on February 20, 1920, in Izhevsk. His grandfather was a foreman at the Izhevsk arms plant. His father was a gunsmith. So was his great-grandfather. He was the fourth generation of a family that made weapons in a city that existed to make weapons. This is not the story of an outsider. It is the exact opposite. Dragunov was born inside the institution. At 14, he owned his own hunting rifle, an Austrian 1895, converted by some local craftsman. That same year, 1934, he earned the Voroshilov Marksman Badge, second class, and then spent close to another year in the evenings at the Osoaviakim shooting school. He finished 7-year school and entered the Izhevsk Industrial College, the institution that existed to feed trained men into the arms factory. He qualified as a cold metal cutter. On his own time, he found the books of Vladimir Fedorov, the founding figure of Russian automatic weapons design, and read them cover to cover. Fedorov's books, Dragunov said later, were his first textbooks in the field of weaponry. By the time he graduated, he was already a shooting instructor. He was assigned to the Izhevsk machine-building plant as a process engineer in the stock shop. His first project was the production technology for a Mosin bayonet. In the autumn of 1939, he was drafted into the Red Army and sent to the Far East. Artillery Survey School first, then the School of Weapons Mastery. He spent the entire Great Patriotic War as a senior armorer, and he never went to the front because a specialist of that level was more valuable in the rear. Hundreds of weapons passed through his hands: Soviet, German, Italian, American, British, captured, broken, worn out, jammed. For 5 years, the state paid Yevgeny Dragunov to look at other men's designs and work out precisely why they had failed. He was demobilized in 1945 and went back to the same plant, into the chief designer's department. His first task was a small one. The Mosin sniper rifle, model 1891-30, had to be loaded one cartridge at a time because the low-mounted PU scope was in the way. Dragunov designed a new mount that let the rifle be charged from a clip, 5 at once, and made the mount lighter while he was at it. He solved it. He became a design engineer, then a lead engineer, and then came the decade that actually made him. From 1949 onward, Dragunov built high-precision sporting rifles on the Mosin action. The S-49 was the first. In September of 1950, Soviet shooters using his rifles set a world record at international competitions in Sofia, prone, kneeling, and standing, at 300 meters. Through the 50s came the rest of the line: the TSV-50, the MPTSV-50, Zenit, Strela, Taiga. In 1958, at the Brussels exhibition, Zenit and Strela and Taiga were awarded a Grand Prix. Over his career, he would put his hand to 27 models of small arms, 10 of which went into series production, and his sporting rifles would carry Soviet athletes to hundreds of international medals. This is a man who understood precision the way a violin maker understands wood: tight tolerances, perfect fit, weight where you want it. He was, by 1958, one of the best in the world at making a rifle that would put every bullet through the same hole for a man lying on a mat on a clean range in good weather with all the time he needed. Which is when the Soviet army came to him with the opposite problem. The Mosin sniper rifle was obsolete. The SVT-40, Tokarev's self-loader, was disliked by the men who had carried it, sensitive to fouling and to cold and never accurate enough. And meanwhile, something structural had happened to the Soviet squad. The Red Army had standardized on the 7.62 by 39 mm intermediate cartridge. NATO had not yet made that move. Its infantry still carried battle rifles in 7.62 by 51 mm, which meant that in open ground every Soviet rifle platoon on Earth could now be outranged by every NATO one. There was a hole in the squad that opened at about 400 meters and never closed. In 1958, the main artillery directorate, the GAU, renamed the GRAU in 1960, announced a competition for a self-loading sniper rifle that had to combine accuracy with reliability and simplicity of construction. Read that requirement carefully. It is not asking for a sniper's rifle. It is asking for a rifleman's rifle that can shoot. Dragunov had never designed a military self-loading rifle in his life. He said so himself. They had a wealth of experience in fine-tuning and manufacturing high-class sporting samples, he recalled, and almost no experience in debugging military ones. All they knew for certain was that the AVS-36 and the SVT-40 had not met the new requirements even halfway. The competition drew Alexander Konstantinov from the Degtyaryov plant in Kovrov. It drew Sergei Simonov from NII 61 outside Moscow, the man who had given the army the SKS, and from a bench in the same Izhevsk building as Dragunov, it drew Mikhail Kalashnikov. In the spring of 1960, the state trials returned their verdict on all of them. Not one rifle passed. The polygon trials of 1960 found that none of the submissions met the requirements. Not for mass, not for accuracy, not for reliability. All of them failed. Dragunov's prototype was called the SSV-58. It shot beautifully and it broke. Stoppages and part failures occurred roughly every 500 to 600 rounds. The magazine was wrong. The mainspring was wrong. And worse than either, the trigger mechanism did not guarantee safe handling of the weapon. On the compliance table, Dragunov's rifle landed in the middle. Better than one competitor, worse than the other. He was not winning. Kalashnikov left first. On the advice of a GRAU representative, Engineer Colonel Vladimir Daikin, he abandoned the sniper rifle to concentrate on a light machine gun instead. That became the RPK, adopted in 1961. Consider that for a moment. The most successful small arms designer of the 20th century looked at this problem and walked away from it. At the end of 1961, Simonov's rifle was withdrawn. Insufficient accuracy, insufficient reliability. Two men left, Izhevsk against Kovrov. Konstantinov's entry, the 2BV-10, was built up from an automatic carbine he had been developing since the early 50s. It was simpler, it was cheaper to manufacture, and it weighed around 5.5 kilograms against Dragunov's under 4. Russian accounts of the trials record something else. Vasily Zaitsev, the Stalingrad sniper, 225 confirmed, 11 of them enemy snipers, handled both rifles during testing and came away saying that both of them were good. The state disagreed. In its resolution of March 16, 1962, the GRAU recommended Dragunov's self-loading rifle as most fully satisfying the requirements for combat and service characteristics and ordered a trial series built for troop testing. Those rifles went out in the late summer and early autumn of 1962 to the Moscow, Odessa, and Turkestan military districts. A rain climate, a temperate climate, and a desert. On purpose. And here is what those soldiers were handed. Every significant decision in the SVD is one of Dragunov's contradictions, left standing, loose against tight. The rifle runs on a short-stroke gas piston with a 2-position gas regulator, and you change the setting using the rim of a cartridge because a soldier will always have a cartridge and may not have a tool. Position 1 leaves a gas escape port open. Position 2 closes it, sends the extra gas to the piston, and drives the whole action harder. That second setting exists for fouling, for extreme cold, for high altitude, for underpowered ammunition. Which means the rifle was designed from the first drawing around an assumption. This weapon will be filthy, frozen, and fed the wrong thing, and it must work anyway. The barrel locks through a rotating bolt with 3 lugs at the bolt head, engaging recesses in the barrel extension. His son Mikhail, himself a designer, later named the 3 ideas at the core of his father's concept, locking on 3 lugs at the head of the bolt, a thermally stable barrel and handguard assembly, and an ergonomic match-type stock. That concept, he said, turned out to be the right one. Light against accurate. The barrel profile is deliberately thin. A target shooter would call it wrong because every gram matters to a man who has to carry it all day. And then Dragunov free-floated it. The barrel touches nothing along its length, so the way it vibrates does not depend on how the rifle is rested or how hot it has become. That is a match rifle solution imported wholesale to solve a soldier's weight problem. The receiver is machined for torsional stiffness. The stock is skeletonized plywood laminate with a thumb hole and a detachable cheek rest, so the man's eye lands in the same place every time. Match ergonomics in birch plywood on a conscript's rifle. 4.5 kilograms with the scope and a loaded magazine. Old against new. The most modern squad weapon in the world was chambered for the 7.62 by 54 mm R, a rimmed cartridge designed in 1891. Not because it was elegant, because it was what the machine guns already ate. Specialist against every man. The PSO-1 optic mounts on a side rail that does not block the line between the front and rear iron sights, so both sighting systems work at once. Its elevation turret carries bullet drop compensation, calibrated at the factory in 50 and 100-meter increments for that specific combination of rifle and cartridge. The optic does the arithmetic so that the man behind it does not have to. On July 3, 1963, it was adopted by the Soviet Army as the 7.62 millimeter Dragunov sniper rifle. 200 rifles were built that year. Serial production at Izhmash began the next. In 1964, Yevgeny Dragunov was awarded the Lenin Prize. The question was, what would happen to a rifle designed for a Soviet platoon once it stopped staying in Soviet platoons? What spread was not a product, it was a doctrine. Once production allowed, every Warsaw Pact infantry platoon included at least one man with an SVD. The marksmen were often picked from soldiers who had already shown they could shoot in DOSAAF, the state's civilian defense sport organization, the same pipeline that had produced Dragunov himself in 1934. In the East German arsenals alone, there were nearly 1,750 of them. Czechoslovakia took it in the 1970s. The GDR issued it as the SWD, and the number that whole apparatus was built around is a startlingly modest one. A trained Soviet marksman was estimated to have a 50% chance of hitting a standing man-sized target at 800 meters, 80% at 500, well above 90 inside 200. And to hold that 800-meter figure, he could not engage more than 2 targets in a minute. 50%. That is a coin flip. That is not a sniper's number, and it was never meant to be. It is the number that closes the hole in the squad, and closing the hole was the entire assignment. The copies came fast, and mostly without permission. China never bought the rifle. The Sino-Soviet split had already happened by the time the SVD entered service, so the People's Liberation Army reverse-engineered examples captured during the Sino-Vietnamese War and produced them as the Type 79 and the Type 85. The modernized CS LR-19 followed in 2014. Iran's Nakjir 3 is a copy of the Chinese copy. Iraq's Al-Qadesi looks like an SVD and shares almost none of its parts. Poland modernized its own as the SWD-M in 1998, with a heavy barrel and a bipod and better glass. Finland issues it as the 7.62 TKY-V Dragunov. Venezuela bought over 1,000 in 2007. Russia donated a batch to the Philippines in 2016. It turned up in Vietnam, in Afghanistan with the Soviet Army, and then in Afghanistan against everyone who came afterward. In the Gulf, in the Yugoslav wars, where it appears in the ICTY's record on sniping. In both Chechen wars, in the hands of both sides. In Iraq after 2003, carried by the Iraqi army and by the insurgency simultaneously. In Ukraine, Kalashnikov. Concern calls it the most mass-produced sniper weapon in the world. No independent total exists, which tells you something in itself. Izhmash built it from 1963 to 2019, 56 years on one production line. The soldiers who carried it gave it 2 names: Plyotka, the whip for the crack of it, and Nubivaya Maya, the unkillable, because it does not fear dirt. Now hold that against what the West was doing. February 1969, the XM-21, an accurized M14 national match with a Leatherwood adjustable ranging telescope. Rock Island Arsenal converted 1,435 of them. It was a fine rifle, and it was a specialist's rifle, issued to school-trained snipers, and it was replaced by the bolt-action M24 in 1988, which moved the West further from Dragunov's answer, not closer. And then, from 1963 to 2001, nothing. Not one NATO army fielded a squad marksman rifle. 38 years in which the object was sitting in plain view, in intelligence briefings, in captured weapons displays, in the hands of every opponent the West had. Then Iraq and Afghanistan happened, and it all came at once. The Marine Corps SAM-R in 2001, the Mk-14 Enhanced Battle Rifle in 2002, the Army's SDMR in 2004, the M39 and the M110 in 2008, the British L129A1 in 2009. Every one of them procured under an urgent requirement written in the field by soldiers describing, in their own words, 60 years late, the exact hole the GAU had described on paper in 1958. The contradiction is why it traveled. That is the whole answer. A rifle that must be tight to shoot well cannot be handed to a 19-year-old conscript in Turkestan and expected back in working order. A rifle loose enough to survive that conscript cannot shoot. Dragunov refused to choose and built the one object that could be given to an untrained man. The testers at Izhmash say it plainly that you can hand it to a completely untrained soldier and he cannot break it, and still reach 800 meters half the time. That is why it ended up in more than 30 armies and on both sides of most of the wars they fought. The West's final answer arrived in 2018. The M110A1 Squad designated marksman rifle, a Heckler & Koch design, built in Oberndorf, Germany. Around 6,000 of them, one per squad. Fielding completed in 2023, 60 years after Dragunov. And by then, Russia's own elite units were quietly buying Western rifles, and Kalashnikov had begun mass-producing the Chukovin to replace the SVD entirely. Which raises the question of what took the West 60 years. It was not the engineering. The engineering was never the hard part. Here is what almost nobody tells you about the Dragunov. On paper, it was never the crude thing its reputation suggests. To pass inspection at the factory, an SVD had to hold within a specified median deviation across 3 10-shot groups. And with the 7N1 sniper cartridge, developed in 1966 specifically for this rifle by Sabelnikov, Sazonov, and Dvoryaninov, with a finely extruded propellant and a bimetal core and a void in the tip of the jacket, the precision demanded of the SVD was comparable to that demanded of the American M24 with M118 SB ammunition, and to the M110 with M118LR. When the Swiss magazine Schweizer Waffen magazine put one through practical testing in 1989, it concluded that the rifle met NATO's own dispersion standard for sniper rifles confidently. This rifle was, by the numbers, in the same conversation as the West's dedicated sniper systems. And in 1975, the Soviet Army threw part of that away. The original barrel twist rate was 320 millimeters, chosen for the heavier match-grade bullets. A target shooter's number, Dragunov's number. In 1975, it was changed to 240. The recorded cost, precision with the 7N1 sniper cartridge fell by 19%. The gain, the rifle could now fire standard light ball with a steel core, the ordinary LPS the machine guns were already loaded with, along with tracer, incendiary, and armor-piercing, all at acceptable precision. Read that again. They had a rifle that could hold its own against the M24. They deliberately degraded its best ammunition so that a soldier who ran out of the good stuff could take rounds off the machine gun team and keep working. That is what NATO could not copy. Not the short-stroke piston, anyone can machine a piston. Not the free-floated barrel, that idea is older than both of them. The willingness. Western procurement kept resolving Dragunov's contradiction in the direction of accuracy every single time, because accuracy is the thing you can put on a chart and defend in a budget hearing. And so it kept producing beautiful rifles for a handful of schooled specialists. 1,435 XM21s, 440 L129A1s, 6,000 SDMRs. The Warsaw Pact resolved it in the direction of the squad and put one in every platoon across the eastern half of the world. Both answers were rational. Only one of them was standing there when the shooting started at 600 meters. And note who paid for it. The testers at Izhmash say it without flinching. A professional sniper from an elite unit will not choose the SVD. For a private in a line unit, it is more than enough. Dragunov did not build a rifle for the best shooter in the army. He built it for the third best shooter in a squad of 9, and he built it knowing exactly what he was giving up, because he had spent 20 years building the other kind. The West did not fail to copy the Dragunov. It never accepted the bargain the Dragunov was, and the man who made that bargain had spent his life building rifles for people who never had to. Go back to Helmand for a moment, back to that sentence in the British requirement. A need to be filled, not a technology gap, not a manufacturing gap. A concept the West had been staring directly at in its opponent's hands for 46 years and had filed as a curiosity. A cheap Soviet sniper rifle, a silhouette in a threat briefing, a weapon in a video game. The word did the damage. Sniperskaya Vintovka, sniper rifle. Soviet doctrine called the man a sniper, so the West translated the rifle as a sniper's rifle, compared it to its own sniper rifles, found it wanting, and moved on. But it was never that. It was the first purpose-built example of a thing the English language did not yet have a word for, and would not have a word for until the Americans coined designated marksman and thought they had invented something. And Dragunov himself was never the man the story wants him to be. Not a rebel, not an outsider. A fourth-generation Izhevsk gunsmith with a single entry in his work record, one plant his whole life. The people who worked with him remembered a large, easy man with a cigarette in his hand, who invited arguments about his own decisions, who listened, who talked as openly with his competitors as with his own team. Kalashnikov, who had entered that competition and quit it, wrote in his memoirs that Dragunov was a talented designer of original mind, and that the SVD remained the most complete system of its type they had. For it, Dragunov received the Lenin Prize in 1964, the Order of the Badge of Honor. Medals, a state prize only after his death. His name became a common noun in 100 countries, and he remained, outside his trade, essentially unknown. He wrote no memoirs for the public. What we have of his voice survives at all only because his son sat down and wrote it out. He was still working at 71. The Afghan war had produced a new demand. The rifle would not fit properly inside an infantry fighting vehicle, and the airborne needed to jump with it, and a folding stock was the obvious answer. Dragunov was cautious about it. Experience told him a folding stock would cost accuracy. Another contradiction, and this one he did not get to trade. He died in Izhevsk on August 4th, 1991, 4 months before the country whose army he had armed stopped existing. Azuri Nestorov's team finished the folding stock without him. He said the work was a series of contradictions, large and small, and the way through was never to solve them. It was to decide, for each one, which side the soldier could live without. Loose over tight, light over accurate, an 1891 cartridge over anything newer, the private over the expert. He got every one of them right, and the proof is not the 30 armies. The proof is that it took the strongest militaries on Earth 6 decades and a war's worth of casualties to arrive at the same 4 answers and announce them as new. There is a photograph in the Tula State Museum of Arms, taken in 1971. 4 men standing in a row: Alexander Konstantinov, Yevgeny Dragunov, Mikhail Kalashnikov, Sergei Simonov. The competition, reassembled a decade after it ended in a museum, in good coats. 3 of them lost. The one who won had spent the best years of his life building rifles for men who shot at paper, and won by building one that would never win a match.